Men have gone silent. The pattern is no longer subtle, and it is no longer isolated. Across modern Western society, men are not protesting, they are not marching, and they are not demanding reforms. They are withdrawing quietly, deliberately, and at scale. This is not a tantrum or a trend. It is a behavioral shift shaped over decades, and it is now impossible to ignore. What makes this moment historically significant is not anger, but absence. When large numbers of men disengage from institutions, relationships, and expectations at the same time, the structure built on their participation begins to show stress fractures. This discussion is about how that silence formed, why it hardened, and what happens when a society realizes too late that the people it relied on have stopped responding. For several generations now, boys in the West have been raised almost entirely within systems designed, staffed, and emotionally governed by women. From early childhood through adolescence, male development has been shaped by environments that often viewed masculine traits not as raw material to be refined, but as flaws to be corrected. Many boys grew up absorbing a consistent message that their natural tendencies were problems that needed restraint rather than strengths that needed direction. When guidance is replaced with correction, identity becomes confusion. When correction is constant, self trust erodes. This did not require cruelty to be effective, it only required repetition. Over time, boys learned that approval was conditional and that silence was safer than expression. In households marked by unresolved resentment between adults, children do not need lectures to learn hostility. They absorb tone, posture, and expectation long before they understand ideology. When bitterness toward men exists in a home, boys internalize it as a verdict on themselves, and girls internalize it as a lens through which men are judged. These emotional climates do not stay contained within families. They travel outward into schools, peer groups, and eventually institutions. By the time many young men reached adulthood, they carried inherited narratives they never chose and conflicts they never caused. Confusion around identity, intimacy, and worth became normal rather than exceptional. Instead of being initiated into responsibility, many were trained into apology. At a cultural level, this dynamic compounded. Masculinity was increasingly framed as something to be minimized rather than matured. Strength became suspicion. Assertiveness became threat. Restraint became the highest virtue, not as discipline, but as disappearance. Public language shifted in ways that signaled to men that their presence itself required justification. The result was not reform, but retreat. When people are told repeatedly that they are the problem, some will attempt endless self correction. Others will eventually step away from the system making the accusation. As this environment matured, pressure did not ease, it intensified. Legal systems, social norms, and public narratives increasingly positioned men as default suspects in relational conflict. The expectation was participation without authority, responsibility without protection, and contribution without acknowledgement. Many men watched peers lose years of effort through processes they could not challenge and accusations they could not survive socially, even when unproven. They learned through observation rather than instruction. Pattern recognition replaced trust. Silence replaced explanation. Social interaction itself became risky. Public spaces that once allowed casual human exchange became zones of surveillance and interpretation. A glance could be reframed as intent. A word could be recorded, extracted from context, and preserved indefinitely. The lesson absorbed was not paranoia, but prudence. When the cost of misunderstanding becomes reputational damage without recourse, disengagement becomes rational. Men adjusted by reducing exposure rather than escalating conflict. Dating culture reflected the same imbalance. Expectations expanded while incentives narrowed. Many men were told directly that their effort was mandatory and their presence optional. They were asked to invest time, money, and emotional labor without clarity, reciprocity, or security. Over time, this created not resentment but calculation. When outcomes are consistently asymmetrical, participation declines. Men began to notice that solitude was less costly than performance and that peace was easier to maintain alone than in systems built on constant evaluation. At the same time, technology accelerated visibility without accountability. Private moments became public currency. Narratives could be constructed and distributed faster than they could be corrected. The risk was not merely embarrassment, but erasure. Once labeled, a man could lose social standing without appeal. In such an environment, withdrawal is not cowardice, it is strategy. Silence became the safest form of self defense. What followed was not despair, but adaptation. Many men discovered that removing themselves from constant judgment created space for clarity. Being alone proved different from feeling isolated. Without the pressure to perform roles defined by others, men began to recalibrate their lives around simplicity, autonomy, and internal alignment. Minimalism was not aesthetic but philosophical. Fewer obligations meant fewer conflicts, fewer expectations meant more control. Peace replaced validation as the primary goal. This shift revealed something uncomfortable for the broader culture. Men had long acted as buffers between systems and consequences. They absorbed pressure, risk, and responsibility quietly. When they stepped back, the strain transferred outward. Economic participation changed. Social rituals weakened. Expectations, once supported, invisibly began to collapse under their own weight. The absence of men was felt not as protest, but as silence where noise once existed. Public discourse began to reflect surprise. Voices emerged expressing confusion at declining participation, declining commitment, and declining interest. Some framed it as laziness or fear. Others framed it as immaturity. Very few framed it as response. Yet behavior tells a clearer story than commentary. When people believe a system is hostile to their well being, they leave it. They do not argue indefinitely. They do not plead for reform. They exit. Men who walked away did not vanish into despair. Many redirected energy into personal mastery, quiet routines, and controlled environments. They invested in health, skill, and stability without the expectation of recognition. Their lives became smaller in scope, but richer in coherence. Luxury was redefined, not as excess, but as absence of chaos. Control over time replaced accumulation of status. The reward was not applause, but calm. As this pattern spread, a paradox emerged. The same culture that dismissed men as unnecessary began to feel the absence of their participation. Systems built on assumption faltered when that assumption disappeared. Social narratives shifted from dismissal to concern, then to urgency. Calls emerged urging men to re engage, to return, to participate again. Yet the tone revealed misunderstanding. You cannot summon back those who left for peace by offering more noise. The crucial insight many men reached was simple: trust observable reality over promises, trust patterns over narratives. When words and outcomes diverge consistently, belief migrates to experience. This is not cynicism, it is learning. Men adjusted behavior based on results, not rhetoric. Once that adjustment stabilized, reversal became unlikely. What makes this moment irreversible is not anger, but satisfaction. Men who found equilibrium outside the system have little incentive to return. They are no longer negotiating identity or seeking approval. They are no longer competing in arenas that penalize participation. They are conserving energy rather than expending it for diminishing returns. From their perspective, the cost benefit analysis is settled. Society now faces a structural dilemma. It cannot coerce genuine engagement, and it cannot shame people back into systems they deliberately exited. Restoration would require trust, symmetry, and respect rebuilt over time rather than demanded immediately. That process is slow and uncertain. Silence, once learned, is difficult to unlearn. This story is not about blame for its own sake, it is about consequence. Cultural incentives shape behavior, whether acknowledged or not. When entire groups change behavior simultaneously, it signals systemic misalignment. Ignoring that signal does not reverse it. It only deepens the gap between expectation and reality. Men walking away is not an endpoint, but a condition. It reflects a broader recalibration underway. As institutions strain and narratives shift, the absence of participation becomes a force of its own. Quiet refusal reshapes systems more effectively than confrontation ever did. The silence speaks because it no longer needs permission to be heard. What remains is a choice for those observing this shift: continue interpreting withdrawal as pathology or recognize it as feedback, continue demanding return without reform, or understand that peace, once found, is not easily surrendered. The men who left did not do so to punish anyone, they did so to survive with dignity. This is the landscape now, not a battlefield, but an empty room where voices once echoed. The question is not where the men went. The question is whether the structures that lost them are willing to change enough to deserve their return. The silence that followed the withdrawal did not arrive with chaos at first, it arrived with calm. When men stepped back from constant negotiation, explanation, and justification, many discovered a clarity they had not experienced before. Without the background noise of expectation, they could finally hear their own internal signals. Fatigue became visible instead of normalized. Stress revealed itself as something imposed rather than inherent. This awareness was not dramatic, but it was decisive. Once a person realizes how much energy has been spent simply maintaining social compliance, the instinct to conserve that energy becomes almost automatic. What is often misunderstood is that disengagement did not come from hatred or revenge, it came from exhaustion. For years, many men attempted to adapt, to improve, to listen, and to recalibrate themselves in response to shifting demands. Each adjustment promised stability but delivered new conditions instead. Over time, the pattern became clear. The rules were not evolving toward balance, they were expanding without limit. When effort produces no durable security, rational actors eventually stop investing effort. This is where the narrative of disappearance begins to diverge from the narrative of failure. Walking away was not collapse, it was optimization. Men reduced inputs that produced negative returns and increased focus on variables they could control. This included health, finances, environment, and time. It meant fewer social risks and fewer emotional liabilities. The reward was predictability. Predictability became more valuable than approval. As the shift progressed, men began to notice something else. Many of the systems that criticized them relied on their participation far more than they admitted. Economic structures, social rituals, and even informal community stability had been built on the assumption of male availability. When that availability declined, friction increased. Tasks once performed quietly were left undone. Cost, once absorbed, invisibly surfaced. This was not immediately framed as absence, it was framed as confusion. Why are things harder now? Why is cooperation lower? Why is there less willingness? The answer was simple but uncomfortable. Cooperation requires trust. Trust requires fairness. Fairness requires limits. When limits disappear, trust erodes. Men did not leave because they rejected cooperation. They left because cooperation had become one directional. Once that imbalance was perceived clearly, participation no longer felt virtuous, it felt naive. The cultural response to this withdrawal followed a predictable arc. First came denial, claims that nothing fundamental was changing and that disengagement was exaggerated. Then came ridicule, portrayals of withdrawn men as immature, fearful, or socially deficient. When ridicule failed to reverse behavior, concern emerged. Articles, panels, and discussions appeared questioning where men had gone and why they were not engaging. Finally came pressure. Appeals framed as moral obligation rather than mutual benefit. None of these phases addressed the root cause. They treated the symptom while ignoring the incentive structure that produced it. Meanwhile, men continued to adjust quietly. They redesigned their daily lives around sustainability rather than sacrifice. This often meant smaller social circles, simpler routines, and deliberate isolation from environments that demanded constant performance. Technology was used not for validation, but for utility. Entertainment became personal rather than performative. Leisure was no longer something earned through exhaustion, but something protected from intrusion. One of the most significant changes occurred internally. Men stopped outsourcing their sense of worth. Without external approval as a primary metric, internal standards gained authority. Progress became measurable through competence rather than recognition. This shift alone reduced anxiety dramatically. When a person no longer waits for permission to feel sufficient, emotional stability follows naturally. Critics often misinterpret this stability as indifference. It is not indifference, it is detachment. Detachment does not mean lack of care, it means selective investment. Men learned to care where care was reciprocated and to withdraw where it was exploited. This discernment was learned through experience, not ideology. It was reinforced every time silence preserved peace better than engagement ever did. As more men adopted this posture, the collective effect became visible. Dating markets shifted, social spaces changed tone, expectations recalibrated awkwardly. Many women expressed confusion at reduced attention and initiative. This confusion revealed an assumption that male pursuit was automatic rather than conditional. When that assumption failed, frustration followed. Yet frustration is not persuasion, it does not rebuild trust. The deeper issue was never attraction or companionship, it was risk management. Men assessed the downside of engagement and found it disproportionate. The cost of misinterpretation, accusation, or emotional entanglement outweighed the benefit offered. In such conditions, abstention becomes logical. When abstention is logical for many individuals simultaneously, it becomes a social force. What makes this force durable is that it aligns with peace. Men who reorganized their lives away from constant scrutiny reported lower stress, improved health, and greater satisfaction. These outcomes reinforced the behavior. Once a pattern produces consistent benefit, it stabilizes. Attempts to reverse it must offer superior benefit, not moral argument. Another overlooked factor is that men did not walk away into nothing. They walked towards something else. Hobbies became deeper, skills became sharper, physical spaces became sanctuaries rather than staging grounds. Time alone was not experienced as loneliness, but as relief. The absence of relational volatility allowed focus to return. This focus produced competence, and competence produced confidence independent of social validation. As this internal economy strengthened, external appeals weakened. Men were no longer negotiating from scarcity. They were not seeking rescue or recognition. They were self sufficient by design. This made them resistant to shame and immune to urgency. You cannot rush someone who is content. You cannot threaten someone who has already opted out. The broader implications of this shift extend beyond relationships. Institutions accustomed to male compliance began encountering resistance through non participation. Workplaces noticed declining willingness to assume extra responsibility without compensation or protection. Community initiatives struggled to recruit volunteers. Informal maintenance of social order weakened. These were not coordinated actions, they were parallel decisions informed by similar incentives. At this stage, the conversation often turns toward blame, yet blame obscures causality. The relevant question is not who is at fault, but which behaviors were rewarded and which were punished. Societies shape behavior through consequence more than rhetoric. When contribution leads to vulnerability rather than stability, contribution declines. This is not ideology, it is pattern. Men internalized this lesson slowly and painfully. Many tried repeatedly to reconcile participation with self preservation. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. When reconciliation failed, exit became the remaining option. Importantly, this exit was quiet. There were no manifestos or demands. Silence replaced argument. Absence replaced protest. This made the shift harder to counter because it offered no surface to attack. Silence also removes leverage. Without visible opposition, systems cannot negotiate. They can only adapt or erode. Adaptation requires humility and structural change. Erosion continues automatically. At present, many structures hover between the two, unsure whether to reform or simply wait for men to return. Waiting assumes that disengagement is temporary. Evidence suggests otherwise. The generational aspect compounds the effect. Younger men observing older men who disengage successfully learn from that example. They skip stages of conflict entirely. Instead of attempting to reform systems from within, they avoid them from the outset. This accelerates withdrawal and reduces the pool of men willing to participate even experimentally. The learning curve shortens. The exit becomes earlier and smoother. This generational transmission is subtle but powerful. Boys raised watching men prioritize peace over approval absorb a different model of adulthood. They see that fulfillment does not require constant validation or sacrifice. They learn that boundaries are not hostility, but hygiene. This quietly rewrites expectations long before cultural narratives catch up. As these patterns solidify, the idea of return becomes increasingly abstract. Return to what exactly? To systems that have not acknowledged harm. To roles that offer obligation without security. To narratives that frame participation as debt rather than partnership. Without credible reform, return offers no advantage. Men who left understand this clearly. The silence, then, is not a pause. It is a conclusion. It marks the end of an era where male participation was assumed rather than earned. What replaces it remains uncertain. But uncertainty does not frighten those who have already chosen autonomy over approval. They have accepted unpredictability in exchange for control. This is the second phase of the story, not the initial withdrawal, but the normalization of absence. When absence becomes routine, systems recalibrate around it. Expectations lower. Narratives shift reluctantly. Some institutions adapt. Others fracture. None can simply rewind. Understanding this moment requires abandoning moral panic and embracing structural analysis. Men did not vanish, they reallocated themselves. They withdrew from arenas that penalized them and invested in environments that rewarded them. The logic is straightforward, the consequences are profound. The next phase will test whether societies can respond with introspection rather than accusation, whether they can rebuild trust through symmetry rather than demand, whether they can recognize that silence is feedback, not sabotage. Until then, the quiet will continue, not as rebellion, but as resolution. And that silence, once chosen, does not need to explain itself. As silence settled into permanence, an unexpected transformation occurred in how men related to time. Time, once segmented by obligation and expectation, became fluid again. Without constant social negotiation, days were no longer measured by performance, but by intention. This shift altered priorities at a foundational level. Men began designing lives that minimized friction rather than maximizing approval. Efficiency replaced exhibition. The value of a choice was judged by its impact on peace rather than its visibility to others. This recalibration exposed how much of modern life had been built around extracting attention and labor without guaranteeing stability. When men stepped outside that cycle, the contrast became unmistakable. Systems that once felt mandatory revealed themselves as optional. Many realized they had been participating not because participation was fulfilling, but because withdrawal had been framed as failure. Once that framing lost authority, autonomy followed naturally. Autonomy changed how men perceive conflict. Instead of engaging in endless cycles of argument, explanation, and defense, many chose non engagement as the most effective resolution. This was not avoidance, it was prioritization. Energy spent on unproductive conflict was energy unavailable for self development. The more men practiced disengagement, the more they recognized how rarely confrontation produced improvement. Silence became not a retreat, but a filter. The emotional consequences of this were significant. Reduced exposure to volatility led to emotional regulation improving almost automatically. Anxiety diminished when unpredictability was removed. Without constant evaluation, self perception stabilized. Men discovered that much of what they had labeled as internal weakness was actually environmental strain. When the environment changed, the symptoms receded. This realization spread quietly through peer networks. Men did not advertise their withdrawal as ideology, they shared outcomes: lower stress, clearer thinking, better sleep, improved finances. These tangible results carried more persuasive power than any argument. Others followed not out of resentment, but curiosity. When curiosity is rewarded, behavior changes. As participation declined, cultural narratives struggled to adapt. The language used to describe men increasingly diverged from observable behavior. Claims of disengagement being rooted in fear or immaturity failed to align with the stability many men demonstrated. This mismatch weakened credibility. When narrative fails to describe reality accurately, it loses influence. Men noticed this discrepancy and adjusted trust accordingly. Trust became the central issue. Not trust in individuals, but trust in systems. Many men concluded that systems designed to interpret male behavior through suspicion could not be navigated safely. This conclusion did not require malice, it required pattern recognition. When outcomes are consistently negative, regardless of intention, intention becomes irrelevant to decision making. One of the more subtle consequences of withdrawal was the redefinition of success. Traditional markers like status, conquest, and public validation lost relevance. Success became private and sustainable. It meant control over schedule, financial independence, and emotional equilibrium. These goals were achievable without broad social participation, which made withdrawal even more attractive. This redefinition also altered how men approached relationships of all kinds. Friendships became more selective, associations based on obligation dissolved, connections grounded in mutual respect endured. The social circle shrank, but its quality improved. Men discovered that fewer relationships maintained intentionally were more fulfilling than many relationships managed defensively. At a societal level, this contraction had ripple effects. Social spaces reliant on male engagement experienced decline. Participation in certain rituals diminished. Expectations, once met by default, went unmet. This produced frustration, but also opportunity. Some institutions began reassessing assumptions, Others doubled down on demands. The outcomes diverged accordingly. Where adaptation occurred, engagement stabilized modestly. Where demands intensified without reform, disengagement accelerated. This demonstrated a fundamental principle. Participation cannot be compelled sustainably. It must be incentivized through fairness and reciprocity. Without those, withdrawal is not only rational, but inevitable. The question of masculinity itself began to shift. Detached from constant criticism, men explored identity without external scripts. Masculinity was no longer something to defend or perform. It became a set of personal standards rather than a public posture. This internalization reduced defensiveness. Men no longer needed to argue for legitimacy. They lived it privately. This internal masculinity emphasized competence, reliability, and restraint, not as submission, but as sovereignty. The ability to remain unaffected by provocation became a marker of strength. Emotional control replaced emotional suppression. Boundaries replaced confrontation. These traits proved adaptable across environments, further reinforcing the withdrawal strategy. As men refined these standards, they became less reactive to public discourse. Headlines and commentary lost emotional leverage. When external narratives no longer dictated self-worth, outrage lost its pull. This disengagement from constant commentary freed attention for constructive pursuits. The mental space reclaimed was substantial. Economic behavior followed similar lines. Men became more cautious with risk that did not offer proportional reward. They prioritized savings, skill acquisition, and portable income. This financial conservatism was not fear-based. It was stability-based. Economic independence reduced vulnerability to institutional pressure, which further enabled disengagement. This created a feedback loop. Financial autonomy supported social autonomy. Social autonomy supported emotional autonomy. Emotional autonomy supported clear decision making. The system reinforced itself. Once established, it required little maintenance beyond consistency. Observers often misinterpret this as detachment from society entirely. In reality, it is selective participation. Men did not abandon contribution. They redirected it. They contributed to areas where effort produced tangible return and respect. They withdrew from arenas where effort was treated as obligation without appreciation. The implications for future generations are significant. Boys raised in households where male withdrawal is normalized may never internalize expectations of compulsory sacrifice. They may approach adulthood assuming autonomy as baseline rather than privilege. This shifts the default setting of male participation fundamentally. Education systems, workplaces, and social institutions that fail to adapt to this shift will encounter increasing difficulty engaging men. Those that recognize autonomy as a feature rather than a threat may find new forms of collaboration. The dividing line will not be ideology, but incentive alignment. At this point, attempts to reverse the trend through messaging alone are insufficient. Behavior changed because conditions changed. Reversing behavior requires altering conditions, not rhetoric. Men are no longer persuaded by appeals to duty divorced from benefit. They evaluate systems pragmatically. This pragmatism is not hostile. It is precise. Men ask simple questions now. Does participation increase stability or decrease it? Does engagement offer symmetry or exposure? Does contribution lead to respect or liability? These questions guide decisions without emotion. When the answers are unfavorable, men do not argue. They disengage. This is the defining feature of the current moment. Silence as decision, not confusion. Absence as outcome, not protest. The long-term consequences remain uncertain, but the trajectory is clear. Systems that adapt to autonomy will persist. Systems that depend on assumption will erode. This is not a threat, it is a description. Men did not collectively decide to walk away. They individually decided to stop bleeding energy into environments that did not reciprocate. The collective effect emerged naturally. This organic nature makes the shift resilient. There is no leader to discredit, no movement to fracture. What remains is adjustment, not only for institutions, but for cultural expectations. Acknowledging that participation must be earned rather than assumed is a profound shift. It requires humility and redesign. Whether that occurs remains to be seen. Until then, the silence continues, not as emptiness, but as space reclaimed. Men who found equilibrium in that space are unlikely to surrender it easily. Peace, once experienced as stable and self generated, becomes non negotiable. This is not the end of the story, it is the middle. The phase where withdrawal normalizes and systems are forced to respond not to noise, but to absence. The outcome will be determined not by speeches or campaigns, but by whether fairness returns as an incentive rather than a slogan. For now, men remain where peace is preserved, attention is conserved, and autonomy is respected. They are not lost. They are simply no longer available by default. As absence became routine, another quiet shift took place in how men related to responsibility itself. Responsibility was no longer treated as an abstract moral obligation owed to systems or expectations. It became contextual and conditional. Men distinguished between responsibility chosen and responsibility imposed. Chosen responsibility strengthened identity and competence. Imposed responsibility without authority weakened both. This distinction changed everything. Men stopped accepting burdens that offered no agency and no protection. They accepted responsibility only where outcomes were clear and aligned with their values. This reframing clarified something that had been obscured for years. Responsibility without authority is not virtue, it is liability. When men recognized this, they adjusted accordingly. They sought roles where accountability was paired with control and declined roles where accountability existed without influence. This recalibration reduced burnout dramatically. It also exposed how many structures had relied on moral pressure rather than fair design. With this clarity came a shift in how men approached obligation narratives. Appeals framed as necessity lost persuasive power when they were not matched by reciprocity. Men learned to separate urgency from importance. Many demands were loud but hollow. They produced stress without producing progress. Silence filtered these demands out. Men conserved attention for what actually mattered. Attention itself became a protected resource. In a culture saturated with provocation, outrage, and performance, attention had been weaponized. Men withdrew their attention deliberately. They stopped reacting to every accusation, demand, or trend. This withdrawal reduced emotional volatility and restored focus. The result was not apathy, but selectivity. Attention was invested where it generated value rather than drained it. As attention narrowed, men became more observant. Without the pressure to respond immediately, patterns became visible. Repeated behaviors revealed underlying incentives. Men noticed how often narratives shifted to preserve power rather than truth. They noticed how language was used to frame compliance as morality and dissent as defect. Observing these mechanisms without participating in them sharpened discernment. This discernment influenced how men interacted with authority. Authority was no longer assumed legitimate by position alone. It had to demonstrate competence, fairness, and restraint. Where authority failed to meet these standards, compliance diminished. Men did not rebel, they disengaged. This form of non participation was more effective than confrontation because it denied systems the energy they depended on. The psychological effects of this shift were profound. Men reported increased emotional steadiness not because life became easier, but because it became simpler. Simplicity reduced cognitive load. Fewer commitments meant fewer conflicts. Clear boundaries reduced ambiguity. Ambiguity had been a major source of anxiety. When expectations are unclear, individuals expend energy anticipating risk. Clarity eliminated that drain. This internal stability also changed how men processed criticism. Criticism detached from consequence lost impact. When men no longer relied on external approval, criticism became informational rather than threatening. Useful feedback was integrated and noise was ignored. This selective listening improved performance and reduced defensiveness. Over time, men developed a different relationship with self discipline. Discipline was no longer about suppressing desire to meet external standards. It became about structuring life to minimize unnecessary temptation and stress. This made discipline sustainable rather than exhausting. Habits replaced willpower. Systems replaced struggle. As men optimized their environments, they became less reactive to social turbulence. Events that once demanded emotional response became background conditions. Men focused on controllables rather than outcomes shaped by others. This stoic orientation was not emotional withdrawal, but strategic focus. It allowed men to remain functional amid instability. The cultural response to this orientation was mixed. Some interpreted it as coldness, others saw it as maturity. The interpretation mattered less than the result. Men were no longer easily manipulated through guilt or fear. Emotional appeals lost leverage. Practical incentives gained relevance. This marked a significant shift in social dynamics. Institutions that recognized this shift adjusted their approach. They emphasized clarity, fairness, and mutual benefit. Participation stabilized where these principles were applied. Institutions that ignored the shift faced ongoing disengagement. This divergence highlighted a simple truth. People engage where they are respected. They withdraw where they are exploited. The idea that men owed participation by default continued to erode. Obligation narratives without reciprocal benefit failed to motivate. Men did not reject community, they rejected asymmetry. They sought environments where contribution was acknowledged and boundaries were honored. This search led many men toward decentralized forms of organization. Smaller groups, informal networks, and self directed projects replaced large, impersonal structures. These environments offered direct feedback and visible impact. Men could see the results of their effort. This visibility reinforced engagement. Decentralization also reduced exposure to bureaucratic friction. Fewer intermediaries meant fewer distortions. Decisions were made closer to their consequences. This alignment improved trust. Men trusted processes they could observe and influence. They disengaged from processes that obscured accountability. As trust shifted toward smaller systems, large narratives lost influence. Grand explanations and moral frameworks failed to compete with lived experience. Men evaluated claims against observable outcomes. When narratives contradicted reality, reality prevailed. This grounded approach reduced susceptibility to ideological swings. The long term implication is a regrounded masculinity rooted in function rather than validation. Men no longer needed public recognition to affirm worth. They measured success privately through competence and stability. This internal metric was resilient to social fluctuation. Younger men observing this model adopted similar priorities. They invested early in self sufficiency rather than social approval. They avoided environments that demanded constant performance without offering security. This generational transmission accelerated withdrawal from unstable systems. The effect on relationships was inevitable. Men approached connection cautiously. They valued predictability and respect over intensity. Relationships that offered peace endured. Relationships that introduced volatility were avoided. This selectivity reduced drama, but also reduced frequency. Men accepted this trade off willingly. Critics framed this as emotional unavailability. Men experienced it as emotional sustainability. The difference lay in perspective. Those accustomed to male emotional labor perceived its absence as deficit. Men experienced its conservation as relief. This divergence in perception widened the gap. Calls for men to re engage emotionally without addressing underlying risk failed. Men required structural change, not reassurance. They needed environments where vulnerability was not penalized. Without that, restraint remained rational. As this pattern continued, social expectations adjusted slowly. Some narratives softened, others intensified. The effectiveness of each response varied. Softening that acknowledged asymmetry showed promise. Intensification accelerated withdrawal. The lesson was consistent. At this stage, the silence carried momentum. Men no longer needed to justify it, even internally. It was simply how life worked now. Engagement was optional. Peace was prioritized. Autonomy was non negotiable. The future trajectory depends on whether systems can evolve to meet these conditions. Evolution requires admitting misalignment. That admission is difficult for structures built on moral certainty. Yet without it, disengagement persists. Men have already adapted. They are not waiting. They are building parallel lives optimized for stability and meaning on their own terms. These lives do not seek validation. They seek coherence. This coherence makes reversal unlikely. Once a person experiences sustained peace through selective engagement, returning to chaos feels irrational. The threshold for participation rises permanently. What remains is not a conflict, but a divergence. Men and institutions moving in different directions based on incompatible assumptions. Reconciliation requires realignment, not persuasion. The silence is not empty, it is full of intention. It is the sound of boundaries holding. It is the outcome of learned patterns reinforced by lived experience. It is stable, and stability, once achieved, is rarely surrendered without compelling reason. As stability became habitual, men began to re examine the concept of contribution itself. Contribution was no longer synonymous with sacrifice, it became synonymous with alignment. Men asked whether their effort advanced their own long term coherence or merely propped up systems that treated them as interchangeable inputs. When the answer was unclear or unfavorable, they declined participation without guilt. Guilt had lost its leverage once men recognized it as a tool rather than a truth. This internal audit reshaped how men evaluated opportunity. Invitations were filtered through impact rather than expectation. Men considered whether a role allowed growth, offered protection, and respected boundaries. If not, it was dismissed quietly. This decisiveness reduced cognitive clutter. Fewer maybes meant clearer yeses. Clarity replaced obligation as the organizing principle of daily life. With clarity came patience. Men no longer rushed toward milestones defined by others, timelines slowed, progress was measured internally rather than socially. This deceleration was not stagnation, it was deliberate pacing. Men optimized for sustainability over acceleration. Burnout lost its inevitability once urgency was removed. Patience also changed how men responded to provocation. Attempts to provoke reaction through shame, urgency, or comparison failed to elicit engagement. Men recognized provocation as a signal to disengage rather than respond. This recognition dissolved many conflicts before they began. Without reaction, provocation lost purpose. The cumulative effect of these choices was a reorientation towards self governance. Men governed their time, attention, and emotional investment with increasing precision. Self governance replaced external supervision. This autonomy produced a quiet confidence rooted in consistency rather than assertion. Men did not need to announce their standards, they lived them. As self governance strengthened, men became more discerning about information itself. They reduced consumption of content designed to inflame rather than inform. Sensationalism lost appeal when it no longer served emotional needs. Men favored practical knowledge over ideological framing. This shift improved decision quality across domains. Decision making itself became less reactive and more strategic. Men paused before committing. They considered second order effects. They anticipated long term consequences rather than short term relief. This foresight reduced regret. Fewer impulsive choices meant fewer crises. Stability reinforced itself. The reduction of crisis altered how men experienced identity. Identity was no longer something defended publicly, it was something maintained privately. Without constant threat, identity solidified naturally. Men did not need to argue for legitimacy, they demonstrated it through competence and restraint. This internal solidity changed how men perceived risk. Risk was no longer avoided reflexively, it was evaluated rationally. Men took risks where upside justified exposure and avoided risks designed to externalize cost onto them. This selective risk taking improved outcomes. Losses were contained, gains were meaningful. As men refined this approach, they became less susceptible to emotional contagion. Group panic and collective outrage lost influence. Men observed rather than absorbed. This observational stance allowed them to navigate volatility without internalizing it. Emotional distance preserved clarity. This clarity revealed how often emotional narratives were deployed to bypass reason. Men noticed how fear and guilt were used to accelerate compliance. By slowing their response, men regained agency. They responded to facts rather than feelings imposed externally. The social consequences of this shift were uneven. Some interpreted emotional distance as disengagement from empathy. Men experienced it as protection from manipulation. The distinction mattered little. Outcomes improved regardless of interpretation. As men stabilized internally, their external environments reflected that stability. Living spaces became orderly, routines became predictable, health behaviors improved, sleep regularized. These changes were not dramatic individually, but cumulative impact was substantial. Life became manageable. Manageability fostered contentment. Contentment reduced susceptibility to coercion. Men who were content required less external validation and fewer incentives. They were not easily mobilized by promises or threats. This independence altered power dynamics subtly but decisively. Power dynamics shifted because compliance was no longer assumed. Men evaluated requests critically. They asked whether compliance aligned with their values and interests. When it did, they cooperated. When it did not, they declined without explanation. Explanation was no longer required. The absence of explanation frustrated those accustomed to negotiation. Silence replaced debate. Silence cannot be argued with, it can only be acknowledged or ignored. Many chose to ignore it initially. Over time, its effects became undeniable. As participation declined in certain areas, those areas experienced strain. The strain revealed dependencies previously masked by routine compliance. Tasks went undone, standards slipped, accountability gaps widened. This forced a reckoning. Some institutions responded by simplifying processes and clarifying expectations. Where simplification occurred, engagement improved modestly. Where complexity increased to compensate for absence, disengagement deepened. Complexity without benefit discouraged participation further. The lesson was consistent. Men engaged where systems respected their autonomy and withdrew where autonomy was undermined. Respect proved more motivating than obligation. This respect had to be structural, not rhetorical. Men distinguished quickly between language and design. Promises without enforcement were discounted. Only tangible changes influenced behavior. As this discernment spread, men became resistant to symbolic gestures. Performative reforms failed to persuade. Men waited for evidence. They observed outcomes over time. Patience shielded them from false hope. This patience extended to personal relationships as well. Men no longer rushed intimacy. They evaluated consistency. Trust was built slowly through behavior rather than declarations. This cautious approach reduced emotional injury. It also reduced frequency of connection. Men accepted this trade off as preferable to volatility. Over time, the cumulative effect of these decisions produced a cohort of men optimized for resilience rather than integration. Integration had once been the goal, resilience replaced it. Men integrated selectively where conditions were favorable and remained independent elsewhere. This resilience altered how men viewed uncertainty. Uncertainty was no longer a threat requiring immediate resolution. It was a condition to be managed. Men prepared rather than panicked. Preparation reduced anxiety. Preparation also influenced how men approached the future. Long term planning replaced reactive adaptation. Men built buffers rather than relying on systems to provide safety nets. These buffers included savings, skills, and self knowledge, and each buffer reduced dependence. And dependence reduction weakened leverage. Men were less vulnerable to pressure once they no longer depended on unstable systems. This independence reinforced silence. There was nothing to argue for or against. Men simply chose their path. Observers often mistook this for disengagement from society entirely. In reality, men engaged deeply with their own lives. They invested in craftsmanship, physical fitness, intellectual development, and quiet pleasures. Fulfillment became personal rather than social. This personal fulfillment did not require validation. Men did not need to display it. They experienced it privately. This privacy protected fulfillment from distortion. As more men adopted this approach, a cultural lag emerged. Narratives failed to capture lived reality. Commentary grew increasingly detached from behavior. Men noticed and adjusted trust downward accordingly. Trust in institutions declined, not because of ideology, but because of misalignment. Institutions spoke in moral terms while operating in transactional ways. Men responded to transactions, not rhetoric. This transactional clarity was not cynical, it was realistic. Men accepted that systems respond to incentives, they positioned themselves accordingly. As incentives changed, behavior changed. Where incentives remained misaligned, behavior stabilized in withdrawal. This stability made the shift durable. Durability is the defining feature of the current moment. Men are not experimenting, they are settling into lives that prioritize coherence over chaos. Coherence has a compounding effect. Each decision aligned with values reinforces the next. Incoherence, by contrast, drains energy. Men chose the former deliberately. This choice reduced internal conflict. Fewer contradictions meant fewer justifications. Life felt simpler, not because it was easy, but because it was aligned. Alignment produced peace. Peace reduced urgency. Reduced urgency protected autonomy. Autonomy sustained silence. The silence persists not as absence of thought, but as completion of thought. Men have considered their options and chosen. They are no longer debating internally. External debate continues, but it no longer commands their attention. Men watch without reacting. Observation replaces participation. This observational stance allows men to adapt further as conditions evolve. They remain flexible without being reactive. Flexibility is preserved through autonomy. The path forward will depend on whether systems can recognize autonomy as a baseline rather than a threat. Those that do may regain participation. Those that do not will continue to erode. Men will not be forced back through pressure or appeal. Only environments that offer respect, symmetry, and predictability will attract sustained engagement. Until such environments become common, men remain where peace is preserved and effort is rewarded proportionally. They are not hiding. They are simply unavailable to systems that no longer meet their standards. This is the reality now, not a movement, not a protest, but a settled way of living shaped by consequence and reinforced by outcome. And as long as peace remains the superior option, the silence will endure. As the quiet became a settled condition rather than a temporary phase, men began to recognize something else that had shifted beneath the surface. Their relationship to expectation itself had changed. Expectations no longer arrived as instructions to be fulfilled. They arrived as information to be evaluated. Men learned to observe expectations without internalizing them automatically. This single adjustment reduced psychological pressure dramatically. When expectation is optional rather than compulsory, stress loses much of its power. This optionality reshaped how men viewed social roles. Roles that once felt fixed became provisional. Men no longer defined themselves primarily through what they were supposed to be for others. They defined themselves through what they could reliably sustain for themselves. This redefinition removed a constant source of internal conflict. Instead of attempting to reconcile incompatible demands, men simply declined the ones that disrupted coherence. Coherence became the guiding principle. Decisions were judged by whether they aligned thoughts, actions, and outcomes. Incoherent arrangements where effort contradicted values or produced instability were abandoned. This alignment reduced self betrayal, which had been a hidden source of resentment and fatigue. Men were no longer fighting themselves to meet external standards. As self betrayal diminished, self respect grew quietly. This self respect did not require comparison. It was not performative. It emerged naturally from consistency. Men did what they said they would do, primarily to themselves. That internal reliability became a foundation for confidence far more stable than praise or recognition. With confidence came restraint. Men no longer needed to prove anything. They did not escalate conflicts to assert presence. They did not seek validation through confrontation. Restraint was not suppression, it was discernment. Men chose when engagement was worth the cost and when silence was the wiser option. This discernment extended into how men processed social feedback. Approval no longer inflated ego. Disapproval no longer wounded identity. Feedback was assessed for utility rather than emotional impact. Useful signals were integrated. Noise was discarded. This filtering reduced volatility and preserved focus. As focus improved, men noticed how much of their previous energy had been spent managing impressions. Without that burden, cognitive bandwidth expanded. Men applied this bandwidth to learning, building, and refining. Skill development accelerated. Mastery replaced performance as a source of satisfaction. Mastery brought its own quiet rewards. Progress was tangible. Competence produced results that did not depend on interpretation. This grounded success reinforced internal metrics. Men trusted themselves more because evidence supported that trust. This internal trust altered how men approached uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer triggered panic, it prompted preparation. Men accepted that not all variables could be controlled, but many could be anticipated. Preparation reduced vulnerability. Vulnerability reduction increased confidence. Confidence without bravado changed how men interacted with the world. They were calm in negotiation. They were firm in refusal. They were cooperative where terms were clear and respectful. They were distant where terms were exploitative or ambiguous. This consistency made their behavior predictable, which paradoxically increased trust from those who interacted with them honestly. However, predictability also exposed incompatibilities. Some systems and relationships depended on unpredictability and leverage. Men opting out of those dynamics disrupted them simply by not participating. This disruption was not aggressive, it was passive and therefore difficult to counter. As these patterns solidified, men became less responsive to emotional escalation. Raised voices, moral urgency, and dramatic framing lost effectiveness. Men recognized escalation as a tactic rather than a signal of truth. By refusing to mirror escalation, they diffused many situations automatically. This refusal altered the emotional economy of interaction. Without reactive engagement, emotional labor demands diminished. Men conserved emotional resources for environments where expression was safe and reciprocal. This selectivity improved emotional health significantly. Emotional health improvements were often misinterpreted by observers unfamiliar with the internal changes. Calm was mistaken for detachment. Stability was mistaken for indifference. Yet from the inside, men experienced relief. Emotional equilibrium replaced constant vigilance. Vigilance had once been necessary. In environments where missteps carried disproportionate consequences, vigilance was survival. When men withdrew from those environments, vigilance relaxed. The nervous system responded accordingly. Stress markers declined. Recovery improved. Recovery changed how men experienced effort. Effort was no longer something to endure, it was something to allocate. Men chose effort that produced progress rather than depletion. This intentionality improved outcomes across domains. As effort allocation improved, men became less tolerant of inefficiency imposed by others. Bureaucratic delays, unclear expectations, and shifting standards were seen as costs rather than inconveniences. Men minimized exposure to such environments. Where avoidance was impossible, they reduced investment. Reduced investment often manifested as minimal compliance rather than enthusiastic participation. Men did what was required and nothing more. Extra effort without extra protection was no longer volunteered. This recalibration surprised systems accustomed to surplus labor. The absence of surplus labor revealed dependencies. Tasks once completed quietly required formal incentives. Costs increased. Efficiency decreased. These outcomes prompted debate, but not immediate reform. Debate without reform did not restore participation. Men observed these developments without emotional involvement. Observation replaced advocacy. Men did not campaign for change. They waited to see whether change would occur. Waiting preserved leverage. Leverage through non participation proved effective. Systems that needed engagement had to adapt or shrink. Men did not need to negotiate. Their absence spoke clearly. This absence also influenced how men perceived collective identity. They no longer felt represented by broad categories or narratives. Identity became individual rather than collective. Men related to others as individuals with shared values rather than as members of abstract groups. This individualization reduced susceptibility to collective guilt or pride. Men did not accept responsibility for actions they did not commit, nor did they seek credit for actions they did not perform. Accountability became personal rather than symbolic. Personal accountability strengthened integrity. Men aligned actions with values because they were accountable to themselves. External pressure lost influence when internal standards were clear. As integrity strengthened, men experienced less internal friction. Decisions were simpler. Choices aligned naturally. Regret diminished because actions were consistent with principles. This internal consistency changed how men approached compromise. Compromise was no longer automatic, it was conditional. Men compromised when compromise preserved core values. They refused when it violated them. This selective compromise prevented erosion of identity. Identity erosion had been a hidden cost of constant accommodation. When men stopped accommodating indiscriminately, identity stabilized. Stability improved well being. Well being improvements reinforced withdrawal from destabilizing environments. Men protected what worked, they avoided what did not. This pattern required no ideology, it was reinforced by outcome. As outcomes accumulated, men developed a long view. Short term discomfort was tolerated for long term stability. This patience contrasted sharply with cultures driven by immediacy. Men opted out of urgency. Urgency without purpose was recognized as manipulation. Men slowed responses intentionally. Slowness disrupted pressure tactics. Time became an ally rather than an enemy. This temporal shift altered power dynamics. Those who rely on urgency lose leverage when urgency is ignored. Men gained negotiating power simply by being willing to wait. Waiting also filtered sincerity. Genuine proposals remained valid over time. Manipulative ones expired. Men learned to trust what endured rather than what demanded immediate action. As this discernment matured, men became more strategic about visibility. They did not broadcast plans. They did not announce intentions prematurely. Privacy protected progress. Quiet execution replaced public declaration. This privacy shielded men from interference and expectation. Progress unfolded without commentary. Results spoke later, if at all. As men grew comfortable with invisibility, fear of missing out dissipated. Men realized that many social incentives were illusory. Opting out did not diminish life, it simplified it. Simplicity brought depth. Fewer commitments allowed deeper engagement where chosen. Men invested fully where alignment existed. Depth replaced breadth. This depth applied to work, hobbies, and relationships alike. Men preferred fewer projects executed well over many projects managed poorly. Quality replaced quantity. Quality focus improved satisfaction. Men experienced pride in craftsmanship rather than recognition. This pride was durable because it did not depend on audience. As satisfaction increased, the desire to re engage with unstable systems declined further. There was no void to fill. Life felt complete without external validation. Observers sometimes interpreted this completeness as withdrawal from community. In reality, men formed communities of choice rather than obligation. These communities were smaller, quieter, and more resilient. Resilience emerged from shared values rather than shared grievances. Men bonded over building rather than complaining. This constructive orientation reinforced stability. As these micro communities formed, they operated under different norms. Respect was assumed, boundaries were honored, contribution was voluntary. These norms produced trust organically. Trust reduced oversight. Reduced oversight increased efficiency. Efficiency reinforced participation. This virtuous cycle contrasted sharply with large systems mired in distrust and control. Men noted this contrast and adjusted accordingly. They invested energy where cycles were virtuous and withdrew from cycles that were corrosive. This selective investment reshaped men's social maps. Old pathways faded, new ones formed quietly. Life reorganized itself around coherence. At this stage, the silence was no longer defensive, it was generative. Men were not merely avoiding harm, they were building lives that functioned on their own terms. These lives did not require permission, they did not seek approval, they existed parallel to systems that no longer aligned. Parallel existence reduced conflict. Men were no longer trying to fix what they did not control. They focused on what they could build. Building provided meaning. Meaning reduced restlessness. Restlessness had once driven over engagement. With meaning present, over engagement lost appeal. meaning grounded men in the present. They were less preoccupied with narratives about the future. They prepared pragmatically without obsession. This groundedness made men difficult to mobilize for abstract causes disconnected from their lived reality. Men supported what they could see and influence. They ignored what remained rhetorical. As rhetoric lost power, design gained importance. Men evaluated structures by function rather than intent. Function determined engagement. Functionality became the new standard. Where systems functioned fairly, men engaged. Where they did not, men exited. This standard was simple, consistent, and non negotiable. It required no debate. And so, the silence continued, not as retreat, but as the natural outcome of a life organized around alignment, autonomy, and peace. As this long arc reaches its conclusion, what becomes unmistakable is that the silence is not empty and it is not accidental. It is structured, it is deliberate, it is the cumulative outcome of thousands of small decisions made over years by men who learned, through repetition rather than theory, what preserved them and what depleted them. No single moment caused the withdrawal. No single event triggered the change. It was the steady accumulation of asymmetry, unpredictability, and consequence that made disengagement the rational choice. By the time many men arrived here, they were no longer asking whether the system was fair. They were asking a more practical question. Does this system require me to betray myself in order to participate? When the answer was yes, they stepped away without drama. They did not need to announce it. They did not need permission. They simply stopped offering what was being taken for granted. What replaced that participation was not nihilism, it was order. Men began to order their lives around principles that produced stability rather than, approval. They learned that clarity beats intensity, that predictability beats excitement, and that peace beats validation. These lessons were not abstract. They were paid for with time, energy, and loss. Once learned, they were not forgotten. The most profound change was internal. Men stopped outsourcing meaning. Meaning no longer came from roles, praise, or inclusion. It came from alignment between effort and outcome. When effort led to growth rather than exposure, men leaned in. When effort led to risk without return, men withdrew. This simple rule replaced endless moral negotiation. Over time, this internal consistency created something rare in modern life: quiet confidence, not the loud confidence of assertion, but the steady confidence of self trust. Men trusted their judgment because it had been refined by consequence. They trusted their restraint because it had preserved them. They trusted their silence because it had worked. This self trust changed how men viewed the world. They no longer experienced disagreement as threat. They no longer experienced exclusion as punishment. They no longer experienced criticism as identity attack. These reactions belonged to a version of themselves that depended on external affirmation. That version had been retired. The current version operates differently. It evaluates, selects, and moves on. It does not argue with environments that cannot be fixed. It does not negotiate with systems that refuse symmetry. It does not plead for recognition. It builds elsewhere. That elsewhere is not glamorous. It is often small, quiet, and invisible. It looks like routines that work, finances that are stable, bodies that are maintained, and minds that are not constantly inflamed. It looks like evenings without conflict, mornings without dread, and plans that do not depend on anyone else keeping promises they cannot enforce. This way of living does not announce itself. It does not recruit. It does not need a label. It spreads because it produces results. Men see other men calmer, steadier, less reactive, and less desperate, and they ask how. The answer is not ideological, it is behavioral. Stop feeding what drains you. Start protecting what sustains you. As more men adopt this approach, the gap between narrative and reality widens. Narratives still assume participation as default. Reality no longer does. This gap creates tension, confusion, and eventually reckoning. Systems can adapt to this change or continue to decay under its weight. Men are not responsible for managing that outcome. They have already adjusted. What is often missed is that this withdrawal is not anti society, it is anti exploitation. Men did not stop caring, they stopped subsidizing instability. They did not reject connection, they rejected chaos masquerading as intimacy. They did not abandon responsibility, they refused responsibility without authority. This distinction matters. It explains why men can be generous in one context and unavailable in another, why they can be deeply loyal to chosen people and completely indifferent to abstract demands, why they can work intensely on personal projects while refusing unpaid emotional labor elsewhere. Consistency has replaced compliance. The silence, then, is not passive. It is active restraint. It is the sound of boundaries enforced without confrontation. It is the absence of reaction where reaction once fueled systems that thrived on it. It is the end of a cycle where male energy was endlessly extracted and rarely protected. As society looks around and wonders where the men went, the answer is both simple and uncomfortable. They went where they were treated fairly. They went where their effort had proportional return. They went where peace was possible. When those places did not exist, they built them. And having built them, they are reluctant to abandon them. You do not easily give up a life that works for one that demands sacrifice without security. You do not trade stability for volatility once you understand the cost. You do not return to noise once you have learned the value of quiet. This is why calls for return ring hollow. Return to what? To systems that have not changed, to narratives that still mischaracterize, to expectations that still assume obligation without reciprocity. Without structural change, return offers no advantage. Men understand this clearly now. They are not waiting, they are not hoping, they are living. What comes next depends entirely on whether institutions, relationships, and cultural expectations can realign with reality rather than memory. The past model assumed endless male availability. The current reality does not. Any future model that ignores this will fail. This is not a threat, it is a description. Men walking away did not create the situation, they responded to it. They adapted faster than the systems around them. Adaptation favored survival over approval, coherence over chaos, and autonomy over compliance. That adaptation is complete. The silence will remain, not because men are angry, but because they are at peace. Not because they want to punish, but because they will not self betray. Not because they hate society, but because they finally chose themselves. Shout out to the 1 hour gang for making it all the way to the end and staying present through the entire conversation. If you're enjoying these angry guy discussions and want to support the work, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description, and it genuinely helps keep these conversations going. I want to know what you think about what was discussed here, whether you agree, disagree, or see things differently. So leave a comment and share your thoughts. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.